In this chapter, we are starting to solve quadratic equations. So quadratic equations are anything that have an x squared. We saw these most recently back in chapter 6 with factoring when we had x squared plus something x plus something equals 0. We factored that. That was the first method we learned how to solve quadratic equations. Now we're extending that idea and moving into solving general quadratic, so not just factorable ones. First method is the square root method. It's a very specific type. It doesn't work for everything. Square root method is just when you have something that looks like this. You have an x squared or a quantity squared by itself or easily by itself, and you want to get x by itself. So you want to solve these for x or y or whatever the variable is. The way you undo squared is you square root both sides. So you take x squared equals c, square root both sides. The square root of x squared, those cancel out and give you x, so that's how we get the x on the left. And then on the right, we have this square root of c. Now you'll notice something a little bit different in front of the square root. We have this plus or minus sign. The reason is because you can have two possible answers. So think with me about 2. If I took 2 squared, I would get out 4. If I did negative 2 squared, I would get out 4. So I can either have a positive or a negative number, which gets me both 4. That's why I have to do this plus or minus in front of the radical. Do not forget that. All of these will have 2 answers, and so the way you get the 2 answers is plus the number and minus the number. So in chapter 10.1a, in the first part, the actual square root method part, the goal is to get the squared number by itself and then square root both sides. And that's to get rid of the squared, because squared and square root are what's called inverse operations. A reminder, don't forget to put the plus or minus in front of the square root. So first example, you've got x squared equals 44. The square's already by itself, so I'm going to go through and square root both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus, so I'll have x equals plus or minus the square root 44. Now, just like I did back in the last chapter, I always have to simplify radicals. So I would do my factor tree on that and get x equals plus or minus 2 square root 11. Now in Hawks, you're going to have to type these in separately, so you have the positive version and the negative version. So you have 2 square root 11 and negative 2 square root 11. Second example, same thing. It looks a little bit different, but the squared is already by itself. You just have all of this stuff in the squared. So I'm going to go straight to square root both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. And then you'll have y plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 100. Simplify the radical. Well, the square root of 100 is 10. So I can rewrite this as plus or minus 10. Now I have y plus 3. I want to get y by itself, so to undo plus 3, I minus 3 from both sides. So I'm going to have y equals 10 minus 3, because I can have positive 10 or negative 10, or negative 10 minus 3. So I have 7 and negative 13. Now notice the difference here between A and B. In A, I didn't really have to do any combining because I didn't have any like terms. I only had the square root of 11. Over here, because that square root simplified and I had 10, that's why I have these 2 completely separate answers that don't look very similar at all. So in these last 2, the first thing you're going to have to do is get the square root by itself. So here I have 3x squared, and I just want regular x squared. So how do I get rid of 3 times x squared? Well, I divide both sides by 3, and I get x squared equals 12. Now that the square root is by itself, that the squared is by itself, I'm going to square root both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. So I'll have x equals plus or minus square root 12. Do your factor tree on that, and you will get x equals plus or minus 2 square root 3. Now in Hawks, you're going to want to split it up and have 2 square root of 3 and negative 2 square root of 3. Last one, need to get the squared by itself. So here's my squared. To get that thing by itself, I'm going to undo negative 96 or minus 96. So I'm going to add 96 to both sides and get y squared equals 96. Now that I've got y squared by itself, I can square root both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. And I'll have y equals plus or minus the square root of 96. And so I'm going to do my factor tree on 96 and get y equals plus or minus 4 square root 6. And I need to break it up, have 4 square root of 6 and negative 4 square root of 6.